Growing up, I was never very good with money. As a teenager, I didn't get an allowance, which sounds like a very spoiled thing to say, but the reason I'm pointing it out is the fact that when I wanted to go somewhere, I usually just had to ask my parents for money, and within reason, they would give it to me. So if I wanted to go to the movies once a month with my friends, then my parents would give me the 10 euros. And I'm not complaining at all, but I do think that having had an allowance would have helped me a little bit learning how to manage my money, because the thing that happened was when I went to college and all of a sudden I had all of this freedom, and then my parents did start giving me a monthly allowance in order to go to college, which again, I was super lucky for, and I understand that this is a privilege. But once I started being given this amount of money, which I was supposed to manage for groceries and textbooks, I was really, really bad at it. And I made a few money mistakes, and I think it's pretty normal. It's just part of the learning curve. But I did learn some things pretty early on because of my interest in finance. I had an accounting class in my bachelor degree, and I just took interest in finance books. I've read Total Money Makeover by Dave Ramsey and a couple others. I will link some for you down below that were really helpful for me. Essentially today I wanted to share with you a few of these money mistakes that we're pretty much all making and how to avoid them, so that you can maybe learn a little bit faster and could maybe skip all of the reading that I've had to do and just take these golden nuggets with you and try to implement them into your life. So the first money mistake that I always made until a few years back was that I didn't have a budget for myself. We hear this one a lot, and budgets can sound very boring, but I'm gonna simplify it for you and just say this. Make sure that you allocate yourself every single month what I like to call play money. And this is money that you can do whatever your heart desires with, be it get takeout, get new clothes, invest in a new computer if you want to. That amount has to be reasonable. I'm not going to say a certain percentage because that's completely up to you. But for example, that amount for me each month ranges between 200 and 300 euros. And what I usually like to do is spend them on experiences, and allowing myself to have that budget means that I pick and choose my priorities. And the way I usually do this is that I create little savings folders in my bank app. Usually a lot of banks should allow you to do this, but they're basically very basic savings accounts that you can always move money to and from using your app. And I will imagine the 200 euros into there, and whenever I'm paying for something that's meant to fall into the play money category, then I will just withdraw money from there. And this way, at any point in the month, I know exactly how much I have left. Some people recommend that you do this with cash. You can go ahead and do that if you prefer to. I personally like keeping it on my bank app because I rarely ever pay in cash, and using my bank app to pay really allows me to track my expenses. So if at the end of the month I'm not really sure where my money went, I can just go back to the app and look at all the transactions, and some bank apps will even categorize all of your expenses for you. Money mistake number 2 is not starting to invest early enough. I'm actually quite embarrassed to say that I only started investing when I was 25 years old, 24 I think, and 24, beginning 25. And the reality is that investments always sounded super scary to me and just something that only finance people were doing. And the reality is that it doesn't have to be intimidating. It's definitely not a 7-headed monster. You don't have to go invest in any stocks. You don't have to learn how to trade. You don't really need to learn much. You just have to learn a few basics. The main thing you want to be learning about is how much this investment that you're doing is going to give you in return. So usually this is just the percentage of interest that you're going to be earning, and depending on what you're investing in, this will either be static or dynamic. If you put your money into a regular savings account, this amount is usually static and it's very, very little. It's also zero risk, but again, you're not going to be making much money from that. What I highly recommend you do is that you go into the bank that you trust and that you're currently at. They will recommend the right sort of risk for you, and depending on how much time you're planning on leaving your money in this investment fund and how much you're looking to make from it, they will recommend the right choice. I went for a pretty defensive profile, and this means that I'm getting quite a little bit of return on my investment, but I'm not running that big of a risk. It just means that the money that I'm investing is going towards more stable sort of investments and less fluctuating, risky kind. Don't ever invest any money that you might urgently need. You should always have your emergency fund finished first before you start investing, but this is just a mistake that I think we all made because we're too intimidated to try. So if this is you, I highly recommend that you look into it. And then that leads me to mistake number 3, which is not having an emergency fund. I personally, for the longest time, had an emergency credit card instead of just building an emergency fund. And this meant that every time I had an emergency, I was just pulling out this card and then being in panic that I had to pay it back within a certain amount of time, or I would lose money and have to pay for it. I tried to build up a 1K emergency fund, which I actually reached, I think like 6 months ago or something like that. And now what I do if I have an emergency is I will use that 1K to pay for that emergency and just replace it. And since it's my own emergency fund, there's no real late fees or anything that's going to be hurting my credit if you're in the States. So having that emergency fund is crucial, and it's something you should definitely be looking into. The next mistake that I want to warn you all against is to just not have a credit card. If you are using a credit card responsibly, if you're putting all your bills on it in order to get like miles or points or to just build your credit because you're in the States, then so long as you're doing it responsibly, I say go for it. But if you're like me and you're in Europe and credit scores aren't really a thing for you, then I highly recommend against having a credit card. You can always have one if you ever need to pay for something online, but there's always prepaid card alternatives that are just, they look like credit cards and they have the CVC security code in the back, but you just load money into it as you go instead of borrowing money from a bank. Another not so obvious money mistake that a lot of us might be making is to buy cheaper things in order to save money. I know that it sounds counterintuitive because I just told you to save your money and just be careful with it, but if you're going to be buying something and you're planning on using it for a long amount of time, it's always better that you actually put good money into it and buy something good quality that's going to last you for a while. So for example, I'm a huge Apple fan, as you'll see on my laptop, and one of the reasons why I always prefer to buy MacBooks is that for the battery life that I get, I mean, the processor never slows down, and the best part is that I can always sell my MacBook when it's getting to the point where I want to upgrade, usually every 5 years, and still get some money back for it, either from Apple or from just selling it to someone else and then reinvesting that money. I mean, I'm not saying that Apple is the best in any way, shape, or form. That's just my personal preference. But for example, I much rather wait and then buy a laptop like this that I know is going to serve its purpose than cheap out and buy something that is going to break or is just not going to have the power or capacity that I needed to have to do my work. Another mistake to keep in mind is that if you're going to lend your friends or family money, you have to do so assuming you're never going to get it back. This is one of the money principles that I remember reading from Dave Ramsey's Total Money Makeover, and it's a huge problem because sometimes our friends or family need us to help them, and I'm all in for helping people. Like, I don't really like knowing that a friend of mine is struggling if I'm able to help them. But whenever I lend this money, even though it's me lending money, I never really expect them to pay it back, just because if I'm counting on that, I'm going to be very anxious and it's going to sort of hurt my budget and money managing skills if every month I think I'm going to get that money back and then I don't. I might make some decisions based on money I don't have. Never really having a deadline for when you're going to get that money back will really help you out. Which brings me to the next mistake, which is do not spend money that you have not made yet. And this one goes for pretty much everything. Financing things is one of those. Like, if you have to buy something with financing, like a car, for example, you're basically buying something with money you don't have yet because you're just assuming that you're going to be making that money in the future and that you're going to be able to keep up with all these monthly payments. But unless you have some crazy contract that, you know, guarantees you'll have income for the rest of your life, never fully count on that, because if this pandemic has shown us anything, is that anything can happen, and if you're signing yourself up for future payments, you could also be signing yourself onto future problems. So just be very careful with that. If you can buy anything in cash, if you could buy a secondhand car from a trusted dealership instead of buying a brand new car and financing it, then that's always going to be the better option. And last but not least, the last mistake I wanted to talk about is being too stingy with your money. I've been someone to focus on extremes when it comes to my money. I've been someone who tried to not spend anything and save all of it. I've been someone who spent way too much and didn't have anything left at the end of the month. I've put myself in credit card debt. I've taken myself out of credit card debt. And if there's one thing I've learned is that balance is so key and so important. If you're indeed budgeting some money for you to have some fun every month, even if that's just $20 or 20 euros, then you're going to be much less likely to sort of binge buy things later. It's kind of like going on a diet. If you go on to an extreme of a diet, then chances are that you're not going to last very long, and then after a certain amount of time you're just going to binge eat and gain all your weight back. But if you start eating in a healthy way that you enjoy, then chances are that you're going to be able to maintain that over time. And that ultimately is your goal. Of course, there's going to be points in life where we have to save a little bit more. If we're saving for a house, for example, then we might want to tighten our budget. But if you're just living your day-to-day life and you have savings goals, but they're not too extreme, I highly recommend that you try to pace yourself in a way that will work for the long term. A little bonus one, make sure that you start saving for your pensions early. I feel like in the States it is also a thing where sometimes your employers will match how much you put aside for your pension fund. So make sure you're taking advantage of that. I personally also started saving for my pension as soon as I started making money. And personally, I put it in a bank account that allows me to not have to pay taxes over the money that I put aside. Make sure you're saving every month, even if it's just 50 euros for future you, because the earlier you start, the less amount of money per month you're gonna have to put aside in the long run. So it's just a win-win. I hope this video was helpful. If you have any good tips or mistakes that I missed, make sure to leave them down in the comments for other people to read, as it could be super helpful. And don't forget to like this video and consider subscribing to me. With that, I will see you guys in my next video.